Peppa Pig, Richard, has changed. One day, George invited his best friend, Richard Rabbit, over to play at their house. Peppa didn't mind. She was used to their noisy dinosaur games, even if they sometimes annoyed her. At first, everything was normal. George and Richard ran around with their toys, built towers from blocks, and laughed loudly. But soon, Peppa noticed that Richard started acting strangely. He suddenly went silent and began staring at a single spot on the wall. "Richard, what are you doing?" George asked, stepping closer. "He's there," Richard whispered quietly, not taking his eyes off the wall. Peppa tried to ignore it, but the longer Richard stayed, the stranger his behavior became. He stopped playing altogether and sat in the corner of the room, whispering to himself. When Mummy Pig called everyone for dinner, Richard didn't move. "I don't want to eat," he said in a flat, emotionless voice. "He won't let me." "Who's he?" Mummy Pig asked, confused, but Richard just shook his head. That night, Peppa woke up to a strange sound. George was still awake, staring at Richard, who was standing in the middle of the room, gazing out the window. "Richard, go to bed," Peppa said, but he didn't respond. Suddenly, Richard turned around, and Peppa saw that his eyes looked strangely empty, and his smile was stretched and unnatural. "I hear him," Richard whispered. "He tells me what to do." George grew scared and hid behind Peppa. Together they went to get their parents, but when they returned to the room, Richard was gone. "Where's Richard?" George asked, trembling. They searched the house and found him in the living room. He was standing in front of the mirror, but his reflection wasn't moving the same way he was. "I'm not Richard anymore," he said, smiling at his reflection. Daddy Pig and Mummy Pig tried to take Richard home, but he resisted, screaming that he wasn't allowed to leave. When his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rabbit, finally took him away, Peppa's house grew quiet again. But the next morning, George started acting strangely. He sat in the corner of the room, whispering to himself while staring at the same spot on the wall where Richard had stared. "Who are you talking to, George?" Peppa asked. "My friend," George replied without looking away. Final scene. Peppa approached George and saw his reflection in the mirror. It was smiling wider than it should have been, and his eyes were just as empty as Richard's had been. A faint whisper echoed in the room. "Now he's my friend." Peppa Pig, Uncontrollable Growth. It was an ordinary evening in the pig household. The sun was setting, casting warm rays through the windows of the living room. Peppa and George were sitting on the couch, flipping through a book of fairy tales their mother had given them. The atmosphere was calm, almost too perfect. But deep inside Peppa, a strange feeling began to build, as if something wasn't quite right. She put the book down and stretched, gazing out the window. The sky had turned darker, taking on a purple hue, and the first stars were beginning to appear. But as she stared at the darkening sky, she felt a strange sensation in her chest, as if her heart had skipped a beat. It felt like some sort of pressure, almost as if she felt uncomfortably full. Peppa stood up, rubbing her stomach. It felt like she had overeaten at dinner, but that wasn't the case. Her clothes started to feel tight. The sensation of pressure grew stronger, and she noticed something even stranger. She was growing. At first, it was only a little bit. Her legs tingled and her shoes started to feel tight, but she brushed it off as a trick of the mind. However, the strange feeling didn't go away. On the contrary, it only intensified. Her legs began to stretch. Peppa looked down in horror as her legs grew longer and her pants tightened around her body. She gasped, trying to call for her parents, but her voice sounded muffled, as though something was blocking it. And then she kept growing. Her legs stretched further and her body seemed to expand faster and faster. She could feel her arms and head elongating. She reached for the walls, but each movement made her grow even more. Peppa panicked, trying to steady herself, but with every step, she just got bigger. Soon she was taller than the house, and everything around her felt tighter. The ceiling cracked as her head scraped against it. The walls closed in around her, and Peppa couldn't comprehend what was happening. The world around her seemed so small. Even the floor, which had once felt solid, began to crack under her growing weight. With every step, Peppa became bigger, and it was harder and harder to control her body. Her movements were slow and clumsy, and she felt more out of control with each passing second. The furniture fell apart, the walls crumbled, and she couldn't stop growing. Everything around her felt smaller, and she felt like a giant moving through a tiny world. Peppa looked around in horror, trying to make sense of it all, but with each moment she felt more helpless. Her body, once light and agile, was now heavy and uncontrollable. She tried to crouch down, but her massive body didn't obey her. Her clothes and the walls around her squeezed in, and she continued to grow, unable to stop herself. As she was nearly bursting through the roof, she felt the house begin to collapse. The walls broke apart, and the ceiling flew off as if made of cards. Peppa stood there, her gigantic body blocking out everything. What was once her home was now destroyed and gone, crushed under the weight of her own growth. She sat in complete silence, surrounded by the ruins of the house, unable to understand how to return to her original size. Her body didn't obey her, and the world around her seemed too tiny and fragile.
It all began subtly. Peppa was the first to notice that her little brother George had changed. At first, it was just small things. He became quieter than usual, stopped laughing, and played less with his favorite dinosaur. He often sat on the floor by the window, tracing shapes on the carpet with his fingers. At first, Peppa thought it was just a game, but then she realized the shapes were always the same. Circles, and in the center of each, two long stretched eyes. "George, what are you drawing?" she asked, trying to peek closer. But he didn't answer. His gaze was empty, as if he wasn't looking at the drawings at all, but sinking somewhere deep inside himself. With each passing day, it grew worse. George stopped responding to her words, ate less and less, and at night, Peppa heard him whispering strange words in his sleep. Sometimes he would get up and stand motionless in the middle of the room, his eyes fixed on the darkness. One evening, he finally looked up at her, and Peppa's heart froze. His eyes were completely empty. The smile stretching across his face was unnatural, alien. "I'm not George anymore," he whispered in a low, hollow voice. One that didn't belong to her brother, but to someone older, someone else entirely. And after those words, he simply melted into the darkness. Peppa screamed, called for her parents, but they only said she must have had a nightmare. The next day, George returned. He sat at the table, eating porridge, as if nothing had happened. But when Peppa met his gaze, he leaned toward her and whispered, "You're next." On the floor lay his dinosaur, torn to pieces, threads sticking out, strange red marks on its body, as if clawed fingers had ripped through it. Peppa could no longer pretend nothing was happening. She noticed something else. In the hallway mirror, George's reflection lived its own life. When George himself sat still, the reflection turned its head and stared at her. Sometimes its lips moved, and one day, Peppa clearly heard, "He is already with us." No adult noticed anything. Mummy and Daddy said everything was fine, that George was healthy. But deep inside, Peppa felt it. Her brother was slipping away into somewhere else, and she was powerless to stop it. A few days later, he was gone for good. His bed was empty. On the pillow lay a piece of paper, the letters jagged and crooked. "He is with us now." Peppa clutched the note, her hands trembling. The house felt colder. The silence hung heavy and thick. That night, she awoke to a strange sound. From the bathroom came a droning murmur, but it wasn't water. It was a melody, faint, hollow, as if played on an old radio. Peppa tiptoed down the hallway, each step echoing loudly. She pushed the bathroom door open and froze. Something was crawling out of the toilet. Its body writhed, slick with slime. Its eyes glowed red, and mingled with the bubbling sound was a dreadful melody. The same haunting tune, repeating again and again. Tralalelo, tralala. It seemed to sing, the sound spreading through the pipes, through the walls, straight into her head. Peppa gripped the doorframe, her whole body shaking. The creature was enormous, rising higher and higher, stretching its long arms toward her. Its head tilted to the side, moving slowly, and then it shook, as if to say, "You can't run." Peppa's throat went dry. She tried to scream, but no voice came out. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The thing slithered closer, its red eyes burning brighter, the melody swelling until it filled the entire house. Peppa stumbled back, step by step, until her back hit the wall. She knew this was connected to George, his disappearance, his words, the strange patterns on the floor. All of it led here. And then she saw him. On the shelf in the hallway sat Labubu, her favorite toy, always harmless before, but now his eyes glowed red and his smile was twisted. He didn't move, yet his gaze said clearly, "You're next." Peppa felt the cold seep inside her. She realized George had only been the first. Now it was her turn.
Peppa Pig, the mirror shadow. The evening was gray and gloomy. Outside, a strong wind howled, making the trees bend and rustle their leaves. There was no rain, but the air felt heavy, as if it could start pouring at any moment. Inside the house, everything was quiet. Peppa sat at the table in the living room, carefully drawing with colored pencils. George was nearby, busy building a tall tower out of blocks. Everything seemed normal. When Mummy Pig called them for dinner, Peppa stood up but accidentally knocked over a pencil. It rolled off the table and disappeared underneath it. She bent down to retrieve it, and then her breath caught in her throat. On the polished wooden floor, she saw a reflection, but it wasn't hers. It didn't move. It just stared back at her from beneath the table, frozen like a photograph. Its little arms were slightly raised, but they didn't match her movements. And its eyes, they were darker than they should have been. Then, slowly, the corners of its mouth curled into a wide, unnatural smile. Peppa gasped and jumped back, her heart pounding. She blinked, and it was gone. Now only her own reflection remained on the floor. Her chest rose and fell quickly. It was just my imagination, she thought, grabbing the pencil with shaking fingers. She rushed out of the room, following George to the kitchen. But the uneasy feeling didn't go away. During dinner, as Peppa reached for her spoon, she caught a glimpse of herself in its shiny surface. She was there, the shadow, that same intense stare. This time, the reflection hesitated for just a second too long before mirroring her. Peppa's fingers grew cold, her heart beat faster. She tried to ignore it, until nighttime. When it was time to go to bed, Peppa entered the bathroom. She turned on the light and stepped up to the sink. In the mirror, her familiar room was reflected, but when she raised her little paw, her reflection didn't do the same. Peppa froze. She took a deep breath. Her fingers trembled slightly as she leaned closer. The shadow in the mirror slowly tilted its head. Its eyes were empty. Its expression wasn't hers at all. Peppa took a step back. The mirror fogged up. Dark smudges appeared on the glass, as if someone was breathing on the other side. Peppa's stomach twisted. Then the glass bent inward, as if something was trying to push through. The light flickered. For a second, everything was swallowed by darkness, and when it returned, the mirror was empty. Peppa spun around. No one was there, but she could feel it.
This is the story of what happened when Peppa Pig's family went to the beach for what they thought would be a normal day. But sometimes, the most dangerous predators wear the most innocent disguises. It was a sunny day when the pig family arrived at the beach. Peppa was building sandcastles when she noticed strange footprints in the sand. Clear impressions of sneakers leading directly from the ocean onto the beach. "Daddy, look at these footprints," Peppa called out. Daddy Pig chuckled. Someone probably just walked into the water wearing their shoes. But Peppa followed the sneaker prints towards some large rocks. As she got closer, she heard soft, melodic humming. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la. Peppa crept around the rocks and gasped. Sitting on the sand was an enormous shark wearing bright blue Nike sneakers, singing happily to itself. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la, the shark sang, noticing Peppa. It grinned with rows of sharp teeth. "Hello there! Want to play?" Despite her fear, Peppa found herself playing beach ball with the creature, watching as it skillfully kicked the ball with its sneaker-clad fins. "You're really good at this," Peppa laughed. "Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la! I love to play," the shark sang back. That evening, a loud knock echoed through their house. When Daddy Pig opened the door, there stood the shark, still wearing its blue sneakers. "Hello, I've come to visit. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la," the shark announced, pushing inside and making itself at home. The shark squeezed through the doorway and began devouring everything at the dinner table. Plates, food, even the tablecloth. "What on earth is happening?" Mummy Pig exclaimed. "I was hungry. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la." It sang with its mouth full. From that day forward, everything changed. The shark decided to stay and established new rules. Everyone had to wear sneakers and sing tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la throughout the day. The shark took over Peppa's bedroom, forcing her to sleep on a mat. One night, Peppa and George tried to sneak out, but the shark was waiting at the door. "Where do you think you're going? Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la, nobody leaves my family." It sang menacingly, dragging them back inside. The house transformed quickly. Windows were sealed with thick glass, water filled the lower floors, and a sign appeared reading, "Danger, aggressive shark inside." Neighbors would walk by and hear singing from inside, "Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la." We're all one family now. Through the round window, you could see them, Peppa, George, Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig, all wearing blue sneakers, all singing the shark's song. Behind them, the massive silhouette swam in circles, its toothy grin never fading. And so the shark had found its perfect family. The beach was quiet again, but if you listen carefully, you might still hear it. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la. And if you do, you'd better run, because the shark is always looking for new family members to join its endless song. The night was unusually quiet in Peppa Pig's cozy house. The silence was so heavy that even the creak of the floorboards beneath the blanket of sleep seemed too loud. And then it came, a soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap at Peppa's window. She pulled the blanket tighter over her head, but her eyes stayed wide open with fear. It wasn't the sound of rain or the rustle of branches. This was different, intentional, as if someone knew she was awake. Suddenly, a shadow flashed across the glass. Light, stretched, but unnerving. And Peppa recognized it instantly. It was Ballerina Cappuccina. Only now she didn't look the same. Her usually elegant figure was withered, almost dried out. Her legs moved in jerks, and her eyes were locked on Peppa with a disturbing, relentless intensity. She wasn't knocking with her hands, but with the tip of a worn ballet slipper, and each strike sent a chill through the room. Tap, tap, tap. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut, hoping it would stop, but the knocking grew louder. Now it sounded like a drum, setting a rhythm. Ballerina Cappuccina twirled just outside the window, her movements unnatural, a grotesque parody of her former grace. She spun and never looked away from Peppa, a silent invitation to come outside. At that moment, George stirred in his sleep and mumbled softly, "Peppa, make it stop." Peppa's heart tightened. She understood. If she stood up, it would become real. But if she stayed in bed, the sound would drive her mad. And suddenly, through the knocks and scraping, came a faint whisper, not from the window, but from inside her head. "You're watching this, aren't you? Press the HYPE button under the video." Peppa flinched. It felt like the words belonged to Capuchina herself, as though her voice was woven into the eerie tune like a broken music box. For a second, it was clear. Someone was calling not just to Peppa, but to the one watching with her. The tapping didn't stop. It grew into a full symphony. Capuchina struck the glass harder and harder, her movements becoming frantic. Her dress whipped like torn fabric, and with each pirouette she seemed closer. Even though the window was shut, Peppa could see the slipper leaving dents in the glass. "Peppa, join my dance," whispered Capuchina. Her voice was sweet, like a lullaby, but within it was a coldness that pierced to the bone. George whimpered and turned toward the wall, while Peppa clutched the blanket, realizing this wasn't a dream. Then the lamp in the room flickered on, casting light on something even more dreadful. On the floor, right by the bed, footprints appeared. Tiny imprints of worn ballet slippers moving toward her. But Capuchina was still outside the window. That meant only one thing. She could be in two places at once. The room filled with the echo of steps. The walls seemed alive, reflecting the dance. It was as though the entire space had become a stage, and Peppa the unwilling audience. But an audience with no choice. She would have to step onto the stage too. "One more step, and you'll stay with me forever," sang Capuchina, her voice now coming from both outside and inside the room. The glass cracked. Peppa gasped and clutched George tightly. She knew one wrong move and the ballerina would be beside her, but staying still was unbearable. Then came the loudest strike. The window shattered into shards, and Capuchina's slipper stepped onto the carpet. She made a graceful curtsy, her eyes flaring red, her smile stretching unnaturally wide. The music of the broken box filled the house, the walls trembled, and the shadows on the ceiling began to dance along with her. Peppa screamed, but the sound was drowned out in the monstrous symphony. Ballerina Capuchina reached out a hand to Peppa. "Now it's your turn," she whispered, and Peppa understood. The knocking would never stop. The dance would never end. She was next.
This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig, Voices on the Second Floor. It was a late evening in the Pig family's house. The wind howled outside, rushing through the dark streets. Rain drummed against the roof, trickling down the windows in thin streams. Everything seemed like a normal rainy night, yet something in the air felt wrong. Peppa and George sat in the living room, wrapped in warm blankets. The television flickered with a silly program, but neither of them could focus on the screen. The house was too quiet. Even the sound of the rain felt muted, as if the walls had thickened. Then they heard it. Voices. They came from upstairs. It sounded like someone was walking on the second floor and talking. But they both knew that Mummy and Daddy Pig had already gone to bed. Their door was closed. There was no one else in the house. Peppa froze. George clutched his dinosaur. The voices were muffled but clear. The words were indistinct, yet it was obvious that someone was speaking. A whisper, a quiet laugh, slow footsteps, the floor creaking under the weight. Peppa lifted her head, staring at the staircase. The second floor was swallowed by darkness. The stairs seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the top step was sinking into a void. The voices didn't stop. They sounded wrong, like someone was pretending to sound familiar, but was failing. The voices grew closer. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. And then they began to descend, step Pause. Step. Pause. Something was coming down. Peppa and George didn't move. Their hearts pounded so loudly that it felt like the whole house could hear them. But the worst was yet to come. When it reached the middle of the staircase, the upstairs light flickered. For a brief moment, they saw a shadow, tall, stretched, and completely still. The footsteps continued. The voices were right there. Peppa couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed George's hoof and squeezed her eyes shut. And suddenly, everything stopped. No more footsteps, no more voices, only silence. Peppa slowly opened her eyes. The top of the stairs was empty, but she knew that something was still there. It just didn't want to be seen.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa came downstairs for dinner to find her family already seated at the dining room table. But something was terribly wrong. They were all sitting perfectly still, their hands folded in their laps, staring straight ahead with blank expressions. The table was set for dinner, but the plates contained food that Peppa didn't recognize. Dark, shapeless masses that seemed to move slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them. Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and George all turned to look at her simultaneously, their movements perfectly synchronized like clockwork dolls. Their smiles were too wide, stretching across their faces in ways that looked painful, and their eyes were completely black, reflecting no light at all. "Sit down, Peppa," they said in unison, their voices flat and emotionless. "It's time for dinner." Peppa approached the table cautiously and saw that her chair was the only one without the strange, moving food. Instead, her plate held what looked like a normal meal, but as she got closer, she realized the food was arranged to spell out words, "Join US." The family continued to stare at her with those horrible smiles, waiting for her to sit down. When she hesitated, they all tilted their heads to the side at exactly the same angle, the movement creating a soft clicking sound like breaking bones. "Sit down, Peppa," they repeated, and this time their voices echoed strangely, as if coming from far away. Peppa noticed that the dining room seemed larger than usual, the walls stretching away into darkness beyond the reach of the overhead light. The family began to eat their strange food with mechanical movements, never breaking eye contact with her, never blinking. As they ate, their smiles grew even wider, and Peppa could see that their teeth had become sharp and pointed. The food on her plate began to rearrange itself, the letters changing to spell out new words. "Stay forever."
Peppa Pig. Mom is no longer the same. The day was gray and rainy. The clouds hung low over the pig family's house, the wind shook the trees, and raindrops drummed against the windows. Daddy Pig had gone out on business, and Mummy Pig went shopping, leaving Peppa and George at home. They played in the living room, building towers out of blocks, but something felt off. The house seemed quieter than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. Time dragged on. It was getting dark outside, but Mummy Pig still hadn't returned. Then the lock clicked. The children jumped. The door slowly creaked open. Mummy Pig stepped inside, but something was wrong. Her movements were slow, uneven, as if her body had forgotten how to move. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, but she didn't shake off the rain, didn't take off her boots, didn't say a word. She just stood there, unblinking, staring at the children. The living room grew cold. The air thickened with a strange heaviness, like the moment before a storm. Peppa squeezed George's hand. Mummy Pig's eyes weren't the same. The whites had turned too pale, almost gray, and her pupils had dilated so much that her eyes looked like two black voids. But the most terrifying thing was her mouth. It hung slightly open. Her lips twitched as if she was trying to say something but couldn't. Peppa waited for Mummy to speak, but she just stood there. Then, she stepped forward. The floorboards didn't creak. It was as if her feet weren't touching the ground at all. The lights in the room flickered as though the air had thickened, turning heavier. Mummy Pig moved again. But now her movements became unnatural, fluid, like a puppet suspended on strings. Her head tilted slowly, and in the dim light, Peppa noticed something strange. Something was moving beneath her skin. Dark shapes slithered under the surface of her face, as if hundreds of tiny creatures were living inside. Peppa shivered, but the worst came in the next moment. Mummy Pig lunged forward, suddenly like a broken doll. Her whole body jerked forward, and her mouth stretched open wider than should be possible. Peppa heard a sound for the first time. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a chorus of hundreds of voices speaking at once. The house shuddered. The curtains twisted with writhing shadows. The walls cracked, and from the gaps in the floorboards, a black liquid seeped out. Mummy Pig rose above the ground. Her arms elongated, her fingers became too thin, and from her mouth something slipped out, black, writhing, alive. The shadows in the room folded into a single mass and swarmed forward. Peppa screamed, but there was no sound. All she could hear were footsteps coming closer, the footsteps of something that was no longer Mummy Pig. This episode of the animated series Peppa Pig has never been shown on TV.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. In the quiet of the night, Peppa was awakened by a strange scratching sound coming from inside her wardrobe. She tried to ignore it, pulling the covers tighter around her. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound, like claws on wood. A thin sliver of light appeared under the wardrobe door, pulsing with a sickly green glow. Peppa's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to call for Mummy and Daddy Pig, but her voice was caught in her throat. The wardrobe door creaked open, and a long, spindly shadow stretched across the floor, reaching for her bed. The air in the room grew cold, and the familiar, cheerful wallpaper seemed to peel away, revealing dark, damp stone beneath. The green light spilled out, casting dancing, distorted shadows on the walls. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. Peppa could see two glowing red eyes in the darkness of the wardrobe, unblinking and malevolent. The shadow on the floor grew larger, taking the shape of a monstrous figure with long, sharp claws. The smell of damp earth and decay filled the room. The figure stepped out of the wardrobe, its form shifting and indistinct, a creature of nightmare. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its red eyes fixed on Peppa. The familiar comfort of her bedroom had become a cage, and the monster was the keeper. The moonlight streaming through the window was swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The creature's growl rumbled through the room, a sound that vibrated in Peppa's very bones. It raised a clawed hand, its shadow falling over Peppa's bed. The world outside her window seemed to fade away, leaving only the suffocating darkness of the room and the terrifying presence of the monster. The last thing Peppa saw before she squeezed her eyes shut was the glint of sharp, white teeth in the monster's gaping maw.